It is now my honor to introduce our keynote speaker this afternoon, Dr. Chris Achen. Dr. Achen holds the Roger William Strauss Chair of Social Sciences at Princeton University. His primary research interests are public opinion, elections, and the realities of democratic politics. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, including Democracy for Realists with Larry Bartels in 2016, which won 2 international awards, was the subject of a special edition of Critical Review, and was reviewed in Foreign Affairs, The Economist, and the New York Review of Books. More recently, he authored and edited a new book with Dr. T.Y. Yang titled The Taiwan Voter. This is to date the most authoritative and seminal work on Taiwanese elections. Dr. Achen has published many articles. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has received numerous fellowships from the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences, the National Science Foundation, and Princeton Center for Study of Democratic Politics. He was the founding president of the Political Methodology Society, where he received the first Career Achievement Award in the Political Methodology section of the American Political Science Association in 2007. He has served in the top social science board of the American National Science Foundation and was chair of the National Council for International Science Foundation, Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, from 2013 to 2016. What he is proudest of are the awards from the University of Michigan for Lifetime Achievement and training graduate students, and Student-Initiated Award from Princeton University for Graduate Student Mentoring. Please join me in giving Dr. Achen a warm welcome of applause.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you to Jennifer and to Lee for those warm remarks also. I also want to say thank you to Carl Ho, my host here, who has taken extremely good care of me, and to Blake Fenton and Grace herself here, the graduate students who are making the administrative things work at this place. Okay. When Carl asked me to do this keynote talk, I knew what was expected. I have been to many keynote presentations over my career, and I've done a few myself. Keynote speakers are supposed to raise the issue, talk about its importance to everybody, give a sense of what the risks are that we face, call us to our shared values of peace and prosperity, talk about how reasoned compromise and cooperation can bring us out to a good outcome, but there's still issues to be worked out, and then say that the following speakers will address these issues without the keynote speaker getting involved in any of them. So as I was being driven to the train in New Jersey, oops, I'm getting feedback here from something, maybe hold it a little farther back. I was being driven to the train to the airport yesterday by my wife. She said, "What are you actually going to talk about?" And I told her, and she said, "You're going to cause trouble, aren't you?" Well, I do intend to cause a little trouble, but also say something about what my real topic here today is, which is relationship of the United States to Taiwan and to China. That is something that I'm better qualified to talk about than Taiwan elections, where I have people following me on the panel who are the real experts. But I'll say a little bit about that as well. See if I can get this to do what I want it to do. There we go. So the event that brings us here is Tsai Ing-wen of the DPP, her re-election this winter as president of Taiwan. She was, as you all know, elected the first time quite comfortably in 2016, and was in trouble for re-election this year. And there was even talk that her party might not renominate her. She was in that much trouble. But as you all saw on the news, there were protests in Hong Kong starting last summer, and those were increasingly contentious for Beijing, and they spoke up, particularly Xi Jinping spoke up forcefully about Chinese ownership of Hong Kong and Chinese claims to Taiwan. And the combination of all that convinced most observers that Tsai's re-election was due to those forces. That issue, Taiwan's relationship to the mainland, is of course the central issue in Taiwan politics, as my co-author wrote in our jointly edited book. This is T.Y. Wong. He has a very powerful chapter in that book laying out exactly how that issue, relationships with China, dominate everything in Taiwan, down to the issue of absentee ballots, for example, which you would think wouldn't have anything to do about that. So in January, Tsai Ing-wen was re-elected by almost 20%, almost a 20% margin. Now, what's striking about this is a graph that T.Y. Wong sent me this past week. What's striking about this is how poorly her approval rating was doing until the Taiwan stuff broke out. That's the red line here. And after that, her approval rating just shot upwards. And you get exactly the same picture from vote intention. So here, as you would expect, the green dots are polling results in Taiwan, and they give the percent favoring the DPP for re-election. The blue dots, of course, are the KMT, and the red ones down there at the bottom are People First Party, James Soon. And you can see that again, the pattern looks a lot like the approval rating pattern. The KMT was running well ahead, and then things fell apart. Now, the final result wasn't quite as bad as this picture shows, but it's nevertheless a striking set of results. Now, this has a seemingly obvious interpretation, this entire pattern, and everybody agrees on it. And that is that Hong Kong and the reaction of Beijing led to Tsai's victory. In other words, people were in Taiwan felt threatened and therefore voted for the party that talks the loudest in favor of protecting Taiwan from China. The Economist says this. I've given the reference there. People in Taiwan have said this. There's a kind of unanimity of judgment about this. So this in turn for American audiences led to a discussion about how Taiwan is becoming more anti-Beijing. And of course that's an issue for the United States in ways that I'll discuss in more detail. So there's been a lot of casual, not causal, correlations reported here that there are surveys showing that if you were offended by what happened in Hong Kong, offended in the sense that the Hong Kong government offended you by the way they were handling the protesters, then you were more likely to vote for the DPP. And that is what we know to this point. Now, I'm an elections guy, right? I'm mostly American politics elections. And so I'm a skeptic by profession. If you have read, for example, that globalization and people living in communities that have been devastated by closed factories and being out of work or having lower paid jobs at Walmart instead of the good factory jobs they used to have. If you've read that that is what gave Trump his margin among less educated voters in the United States, and that has been said 10,000 times since 2016, it's very easy to show that that is false, that there is no relationship between those two things, and that his election was not due to that. And that I think now is pretty much a consensus among those of us who study American elections. So I start with the following proposition. If everybody thinks they understand the election, you better check, right? You better check. And so people have begun checking now with Taiwan, some in more detail than I have, but I'll just give you a sense of why I was cautious. Now, actually, this is a little bit of a reconstruction. What I really started out to do was to show that everybody was right so I could move on to other topics. And it didn't work quite that way. So, why be cautious? Taiwan polling of the kind that I showed you on that slide a little bit ago is often done by political parties or by newspapers with a partisan slant. My friends in Taiwan who do polling professionally wrinkle their nose when they read those polls. They don't necessarily trust them. And so it makes sense to be a little cautious. It's often quite hard to tell reading those articles how the work was done, how large the sample was, what the response rate was, any of the things that a professional wants to know. The other aspect of this is that makes me nervous is the post hoc ergo propter hoc. This is old-fashioned Latin. That's really medieval Latin, so not even very, Cicero wouldn't have approved. But anyway, it's the argument that if something happened before something else, it must have been the cause of it. And of course, the idea is that that's an untrustworthy way to do inferences. So the fact that Hong Kong blew up and then Tsai improved in the polls isn't necessarily a proof that Hong Kong, one of the very first, and still to my mind, one of the best American election studies is a study of a case like this. Now, nothing happened particularly in 1948 like Hong Kong or external, but there was no dramatic event. What happened, that book showed, was that a lot of people came home. They came home to the party to which they belonged, to the labor union loyalties to which they belonged, to the religious loyalties to which they belonged. In other words, you can get recovery in an election from a bad start if you're a candidate for reasons that don't have anything to do with external events. So again, I had that in mind thinking about this particular case. And then lastly, I thought about the way the argument has been put, that election, the 2020 election, was about ideas and ideologies, ideas about Hong Kong and so forth. You know, that's rarely how elections work. The voters are busy. They have a life. Their mother is ill and possibly dying. The kid is crying for the next room because it has flu. And they're just not going home at night and saying, I wonder how I should be thinking about foreign policy. They're busy. And so it's more typically the case that group loyalties matter in elections and the state of the economy. So all of this was in the back of my mind as I thought about the Taiwan case, the 2020 election. But I still thought if I just looked at the data, it would turn out that everybody was right and we could move on. So to do that, I wanted to look not at surveys because I didn't have good academic surveys in hand. There are beginning to be some now, but I didn't have them. So I just wanted to look at real votes and see how those came out. So let's first review the general shape of the election. The DPP got just over 56% in 2016 and just over 57% in 2020. So Tsai gained 1 percentage point. The KMT actually gained quite a bit more than that. The 2016 mess for the KMT with changing candidates and everything didn't do them any good. PFP fell quite a bit because mostly in 2016, I think they were I have a good friend who's a Republican, but also a serious lawyer. He can't stand Donald Trump. He voted for the Libertarians in 2016. It's a kind of a way to not vote for the Democrats, who he can't stand, but not support Trump. That was his calculation. Well, in the same way, the PFP provided a place for ordinary KMT voters to go who were not enthusiastic about the mess in the KMT in 2016. Nevertheless, if you add up the pan-blue votes, that's also just a 1 percentage point change. They actually did just a little less than 1% lower in 2016 than they did in 2020. So what we're talking about here with Tsai's re-election is a 1 percentage point change, a 1 percentage point change. That's about half of the vote shift that elected Donald Trump, for example. Now, of course, the switch from 2012 to 2016 was much larger, but these two elections are close together. So that tells you that there was no big surge here relative to 2016. It's almost a rerun of 2016. But that raises a question, right? If nothing changed, if you have something you're trying to understand, which is a constant, then it's hard to explain it with something that's changing, like the Hong Kong situation. So what I see here at first glance in these two elections is that they were a replay. And that led me to wonder whether the story is as simple as what journalists have said it was. Now, oops, I want this to go backwards and I can't get it to go backwards. Everything I do is forward. There we go. Where did the DPP gain and where did they lose? And that is a more mixed story than you might guess. If you look at the counties, Taiwan's counties, and set aside Kinmen and Liancheng, which are tiny, then 11 of the counties were up for the DPP and 9 were down. In other words, in 9 of the 20 decent-sized counties and big cities in Taiwan, the DPP actually lost votes, which wasn't obvious to me. And if anti-China sentiment was the main thing that was mobilized in this election, then it ought to be the case that the DPP gains should have come in green areas, and their losses should have come in blue areas, right? If you make China a bigger issue, then the people who are unhappy with China should be the ones voting for you more. And if it's a big issue and the people who are sympathetic to China, or at least are not antagonistic, they shouldn't be very much offended. So is that how it worked? Where did the DPP gain? Here are the counties and the big cities with the biggest gains for the DPP. Their gains here are, these four range between 3.1 and 4.4 percentage points. Who are these people? Not a single one of the four gave the DPP more than 51% in 2016. In other words, these were areas where the DPP did worse in 2016 than in most of the rest of Taiwan. So where is the DPP gaining? Not in hotbeds of independent sentiment. They gained in the areas that lean KMT and are sympathetic to the KMT. That was a little odd to me. And then conversely, where did they lose? Well, the DPP didn't lose quite as much anywhere, but they did lose a little here and there. And Yunlin, where they did lose by almost 2 percentage points, they had gotten over 63% of the vote there in 2016. In fact, in 4 of the 5 counties where they lost more than a percentage point, they had gotten 63% of the vote or more in 2016. In other words, it's the places where the DPP is strongest and where independent sentiment is strongest, that's where they lost. That's where they lost. Now that is an odd set of circumstances if Hong Kong and antagonism to China is the main issue. So you might say, well, you're looking at 2016 to measure independence sentiment, and then you're taking deviations from 2016. That mixes those two things together a little too much. So what I did was look at the 2004 referendums that Chen Shui-bian put on the ballot. These are not directly about independence. He started to make them about independence, and then both Beijing and Washington became hysterical, and so he calmed it down. These are measures about, I'll show you the wording of. The second one, the data are screwed up. I'm going to just use the first one. These votes were definitely influenced by partisanship. The DPP told people to vote yes. The KMT told people to abstain, because that would get the number of votes below the 50% threshold that they needed to enact them. So there was an influence of partisanship, but the people who studied it, including my friend Chi Wang at National Genji, says it wasn't just partisanship. So here's the referendum. There's the Chinese wording, and there's the English wording. And as you can see, it draws on that issue of relationship with China, but it doesn't openly say we should be independent or anything of that kind. So I use that as my measure of pro-independent sentiment, because you can get that by village, li, right? And there are about 1,700 li in Taiwan, so you get a lot of variation, different parts of the country, multiple villages in each county, and all the rest of that. So the way I measured approval here was to take the number of approval votes and divide it by the number of eligibles. That means that people who voted yes, people who voted no, and people who abstained are all in the denominator. And so the proportion of approval votes is the measure of how enthusiastic you were about independence. And that comes from 2004, so it's not contaminated by DPP's victories in 2016 and 2020. So now the question is, if we look at the places that are pro-independence on this measure, is that where the DPP gained? That's where the DPP should have gained if the regular story is right. Now, what about the places that are not very enthusiastic about independence? They shouldn't have given votes to the KMT if the conventional story is right. Well, here are the data. You can see that the places on the left there that are the least enthusiastic about independence, places that gave less than 30% in the independence referendum in 2004, the DPP gained about 2 percentage points in those places. And it goes smoothly down to the places that were above 50% in 2004, and therefore pro-independence, where the DPP got hammered by about a point and a half. So again, it just doesn't look to me as though this was a surge to decide based on Hong Kong or nasty remarks by Xi Jinping or any of that. It looks as though something else was going on. 2020 looks a lot like 2016, but if anything, you'd say that the relationship to anti-China sentiment was weaker in 2020 than in 2016, based on all of this. Now, this is just a start, right? I am not one of the following people who are doing serious research. I am just raising a question. And the question I'm raising is, what the heck made it come out like this? I just don't get that. It doesn't seem to be turnout. The higher the turnout, the lower the vote was for the DPP, just barely, correlation of -0.05. Some places where turnout was higher, DPP did better. Some where it was higher, they did worse. So if you're thinking, well, what about that surge of youthful voters who are anti-China? I don't know. They came and went by county, as far as I can see. You can concoct a story, you know. Maybe the people who live in the DPP areas are more rural, they have less information, the economy wasn't doing well, they voted against the incumbents. And in the bigger cities, they were doing better economically, they were paying attention to Hong Kong. Something like that would make the story come out the way to fit the evidence I've shown you, but I'm just making that up, right? We just don't. At this point, we just don't know. In any case, it doesn't seem to me easy to say that Hong Kong caused the outcome of this election. I just don't see how that works. And I can be persuaded this is just a start, but I think there are real questions here. Now, why does this, how am I doing on time? Okay. Why does this matter? Now I'm back to what I'm supposed to be talking about, which is U.S. foreign policy. But why does this matter? It matters because unsophisticated interpretations of Taiwan elections are very common. And this was a much larger problem in the 90s than it is now, because Beijing has gotten a little smarter, a little. And some things are not as foolish as they were. I was in Beijing in 1987 and met with people at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences who advised the government on Taiwan and related issues, and they wouldn't have passed my freshman course. They just didn't know what they were doing. They just didn't know Taiwan at all, and that has changed. They've gotten better. But as late as 1995, as everybody in this room knows, China launched missile tests around Taiwan, preceding the legislative Yuan elections. And at this point, legislative Yuan elections were separate from presidential elections and came before. So they launched missiles into the waters around Taiwan. And the new party, the pro-Beijing party, gained votes. And they seem to have concluded that if a few missiles were helpful in 1995, several more would be even better in 1996. And so they did that in front of the 1996 presidential elections. And of course it backfired. And Li Donghui was reelected very comfortably. And you know, any competent student of elections could have told them that this was not going to work. In the United States, we often have a preference in other countries' elections. We are deeply silent about what our preference is, because if we intervene, then the other side uses that as an argument for voting for them. And Beijing didn't know that. Now, this was a crisis in 1996. We already had a carrier group in the area. We sent another carrier group. This is the Clinton administration. We never got anywhere near war. As one friend of mine said, the Chinese probably found out about the second carrier group from CNN. Was 200 miles out into the Pacific. But nevertheless, we sent a signal. And that signal was important at that time because we knew that if war broke out, the Chinese Navy would be at the bottom of the ocean in the next hour. And they knew that. And we knew they knew that. And so there was a heavy force imbalance at that time that made it easier for us to throw our weight around. That was easy for us to do. That is much less easy to do now. The Chinese are building up militarily very, very fast and very heavily. They say that this buildup is not directed against any particular foreign power, just one that happened to have quite a few aircraft carriers. Well, we can guess which country that is. So the threat to the United States of getting involved in a war with China is much larger than it was 25 years ago when the last serious crisis broke out. Now,
Why do I talk about that? Well, because I believe that the current election is being widely interpreted as an intensification of anti-Beijing sentiment on the island, on Taiwan. And in turn, that makes Beijing nervous. And there's already been some speculation by a woman named Mastro in the LA Times right after the election that Beijing will conclude from this election that a soft approach, the carrots and the carrot and stick, the carrots don't work, and they need a bigger stick. And that, of course, is extremely dangerous. And it's particularly dangerous for the United States, because we are almost surely going to be involved in any conflict across the straits. So most people here, no doubt, know very well what the American position on Taiwan is, but let me just go through it. When I go through it for students at my university who are from the mainland, they say, wow, that's not the story we heard in China. And I say, well, maybe you're not getting the full story in China. The first and the crucial point is we have no position on China's status. We have no official position. That is to say, whether Taiwan goes back to the mainland or becomes independent or continues its current status quo, we don't take any position on that. We have no standing on that. We say that's up to the people on both sides of the strait to settle, and whatever they agree on, we will support. We don't have a position. We have conceded that there is a sense on both sides of the strait that there is only one China. And then we say, of course, that could mean a variety of things, and we leave that up to the people in the area. So again, we just don't get involved. We oppose the use of force. So when Chen Shui-bian was talking about an independence referendum, that would have changed the status of Taiwan in a one-sided way that was not agreed to by both sides. We lean toward Beijing. When Beijing said, and they've said again recently, that they reserve the right to use force to change the status of Taiwan, again, that's an agreement that's an outcome not agreed to by both sides, and we lean toward Taipei when they do that. So we are a balancer. We're a balancer. And we have a policy of strategic ambiguity about whether we would defend Taiwan if they were attacked. That is, we say that they're pretty important to us. But we don't say we will defend Taiwan if it's attacked by the mainland. I think in practice, strategic imperatives would probably compel us to defend Taiwan against an unprovoked attack. That would result in a frightening major war, but any competent American administration would probably do that. Now, what unprovoked means is, I leave to you. That's an ambiguous word. What competent administration means is also a little ambiguous in the U.S. at this point. I leave that interpretation to you also. And as I say, it's just getting harder. The war would not be very one-sided anymore. I think we would still win it, but another 20 or 30 years is not so clear. Other countries could easily be pulled in, and a third world war could easily be set off. So as one former Korean student of mine, who's now a professor herself, says, the alliances are all in place. And that's exactly correct. So it has the feeling of late 19th century, early 20th century Europe. Those alliances were all in place also. And we had a couple of close calls, 1908 in Bosnia, for example. World War I did not break out, and then finally it did. So it's dangerous. It's dangerous. Taiwan is an international flashpoint. It is as clear a case as we have. It's kind of replaced Berlin as the place place where the next World War might easily break out. And ladies and gentlemen, we can't afford dumb mistakes and misinterpretations. So what I do for a living is just study elections. This is entertaining. This time of year in the United States, I get a lot of questions. What do you think? You know, can Bloomberg make it? And so on. People want to know what I think, even though I start every sentence by saying I don't know how it's going to come out. But you know, we study them. There's a lot to do. We've got 50 states plus the District of Columbia. They're often rather different from each other. There's a lot to talk about. It's a lot of fun. It matters for who becomes president, but it's probably not going to set off World War III. Elections in Taiwan could set off World War III. So, as Shelley Rigger, who many of you know, Taiwan expert, particularly on the DPP, teaches at Davidson College and is a product of my department, along with James Madison, who wrote the U.S. Constitution, is a product of my department. There are some other colorful people, products of my department, that I won't mention right at the moment. And she says that, contrary to what people think, Taiwan's elections have generally enforced moderation. That is to say, they pulled both parties back toward centrist positions and support for the status quo. And that is what worries me about the standard interpretation of this year's election, is that it's quite different. This standard interpretation is that things got worse this year, and that Taiwan is drifting away, and this election proved a point. And that point is that Taiwan people are getting more anti-Beijing. I don't see that in the data that I look at. Maybe it's true, maybe more detailed analysis will show it. We'll have a chance to listen to the real professionals a little later this afternoon on this point, but I'm keeping my hand on my wallet at the moment about that conclusion. And I think it's dangerous to make a mistake. So I love talking about elections. You can get me quite excited about local elections in little towns like the one I live in. It doesn't matter how it comes out most of the time, but I just love talking about them. And mostly, I do this with other people who study elections, and there are no international consequences. This one, ladies and gentlemen, can have dramatic international consequences. So understanding this election seems to me way more important than the average election. And for exactly that reason, I think it's important to get our understanding of it exactly right. And that will be the job of the people who follow me this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Q&A? Okay. So I think we have some time. We're going to have a tea break at 2:40, but if anyone has some questions for Dr. Achen, we can maybe answer those for about 15-ish minutes. Yes.
Gentleman here.
Dr. Achen.
Dr.
One
Achen.
question.
My name is Charles Koo. Excuse me. In 2018, the DPP suffered tremendous loss of support, and that made the KMT and Hangguoyu the landslide victory.
Yes.
But do you think the trend will come back again, because of the poor policy and unpopular, government? Will that, in a couple of years, they will slide again?
I'm going to start my remarks by saying exactly what I say about will Trump be reelected. I don't know. But I think that's entirely possible. And a striking feature of Taiwan's brief history with electing presidents is 8 years of the KMT, it begins with 8 years of the KMT, the last 4 of which were elected under
Li Dongwei. Then we got 8 years of the DPP. Then we got 8 years of the KMT. And now we're gonna have 8 years of the DPP. Well, even a 5-year-old can guess what's supposed to come next. So I think it's entirely possible. We know from other research that people simply get tired of parties in power, all else equal. Even if the economy's the same and everything else is the same, if you've been in a long time, they're more likely to throw you out. And that's a kind of a blessing about democracy, right? You can't say that about the Communist Party of China. They've been in quite a while, and there's no way to get rid of them. So my guess is, if you said to me, you have to bet $1,000 right now on the 2024 Taiwan election, and you can have the KMT or the DPP, I would take the KMT. But that's all I know. And how it'll, you know, the state of the economy, what happens with China, those are all big uncertainties. I'm gonna, let me go to somebody else, then I'll come back to you. Sorry.
This is Suzanne Chen from the Taiwanese Chamber of Commerce. And you mentioned about the anti-China, the Taiwanese government, the government. What I'm going to ask is, what's the impact you think after the election for Taiwan's economics? Because right now, China, they stop sending the tourists to Taiwan and also start ordering goods, merchandise from Taiwan. So what's the impact? What do you see the future will be?
Well, can you hear me if I just talk without the microphone?
Yes.
Is it okay? They are trying to harm the economy, obviously. This is their response to the election. They threatened to do that, and they're going to do it. Taiwan is going to respond to that, right? So, you know, in political and social life, you can't just think about the first step. You have to think about how your opponents are going to respond. So we have candidates talking about how they are the ones that can raise working class turnout. Well, that's great, but if people see that coming, won't other kinds of turnout rise to cancel it too? We know that is usually the case. So arms races, the same thing. You have to think about how your opponent will respond. So how is Taiwan going to respond to a situation in which they may not be able to sell as much to China or do as much business with China as they have been? They're already making efforts to redirect their markets and so on. So I don't know how much harm to the economy will result in the end. Some. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but China will do their best to make it expensive. You can count on that. And they did during the Chen Shui-bian administration as well.
Yeah, my name is Li Pingyuan. I'm a TBA member. And I would like to ask, have you studied the Hong Kong election? Because it seems it changed quite a bit compared to Taiwan. In your opinion, the Taiwan election, the fundamental hasn't been changing much since in the last 4 years.
Yes. This is quite an interesting question. Traditionally in Hong Kong, the people support democracy and would like to get out from under China's yoke. They say that when you interview them. But then they vote for the pro-Beijing parties. That's what they've always done until this most recent election. And there have been very good studies that suggest that the pro-Beijing parties are much better at doing constituency work, as we call it in this country. In other words, going around and seeing people. So in this one very nice book, there's a discussion of this one pro-Beijing Hong Kong counselor who has been to visit this older woman
who's pretty much confined to her apartment. And she says, he's been here more than my son. So that kind of effort can get people to vote for you, even if they don't agree with your politics. And so that's the standard interpretation of why the pro-Beijing parties have done better. I don't know whether that's going to work this time or not, right? This is an extremely important Hong Kong election. And I have been bothering my host here, who's part of the Carl Ho, who's part of the Hong Kong election project. I've been bothering him with thoughts about how the study should be done, just because it's so important for exactly the reasons you say. And that might be quite a big change. If it is a big change, Beijing is going to be hysterical about that too. Now they've got two areas that they think of as their provinces, voting against them in large numbers. And again, that will add to the tensions. So your question is quite important, I think. Lady in the back.
Do you think China will have any kind of reaction to the result of the Taiwan election? And so far we haven't seen anything that, do you think it's because they are busy dealing with coronavirus?
They're a little busy right now. If they would focus their attention on shutting down these wild animal selling spots around China instead of worrying about Taiwan, I would be much happier. They did a little of that after SARS, and then they stopped, and so now we're back to these current problems. And some of these animals that are transmitting these diseases, I've never even heard of their names before. So they're busy at the moment, but they keep repeating, and this was, as you know well, well before Xi Jinping took over. They said the same thing over and over. And when you talk to, we had my office has nothing to do with the China Center at Princeton, but just by chance, it is right next to the China Center. So we see China visitors, and sometimes I get pulled into talking to them. And it just doesn't occur to them that there is anything to talk about here, that Taiwan is just part of China, and it would be like someone saying, well, Nebraska is not part of the United States. It sounds like that to them. So he has widespread support, and it's a long-standing Chinese position. And a lot of Americans have taken the view there's nothing we can do about this. They're a big, increasingly powerful country, and they have this view, and whether we agree with it or not just doesn't matter. We're going to have to let Taiwan go back to China eventually. Not everybody thinks that, but China's fixed position on this point is a real issue for American foreign policy, because we need their help on other things, like North Korea, for instance. So how they will react, I think, is not settled yet. They'll certainly do what they can to harm the economy. Mostly they've been patient, and we all have a stake in their being patient, because it is just incredibly dangerous. He's had one round. Let me go to you. Yeah.
I'll just stand up. I'm Paul Grimes, city mechanic we met earlier. Can you comment a little bit about how the younger Taiwanese voters view this election? Did you broke it down by generation? I'm just kind of curious as to what's the viewpoint of the younger folks, given the fact that Taiwan's an aging society, and
Yes.
that plays a role.
There is no way to do that with the kind of voting returns I have, or not a very good way, because young and old people live together in the same town, and it's like gender. You can't separate men from women by looking at municipalities, so I'm not able to do that. There is, however, a lot of survey data on this point, and younger people are farther out to the anti-China position. Combination of their, having grown up thinking of themselves as just citizens of Taiwan. And then also the Chen Shui-bian administration put in this different high school curriculum that emphasizes more.
Education reform.
I'm sorry?
That was the education reform.
Yes, exactly. That emphasized more Taiwan history instead of Chinese history, so they stopped teaching Taiwan students about how they owned Tibet and stuff like that, which was the old KMT curriculum. So this younger generation has grown up with different socialization and different life experience. And there's just no question that they've drifted away. And so, it's hard for Americans not to think about this other set of colonies 200 years ago. They spoke the same language as their colonial masters. The colonial masters said, well, you just belong to us and we've done so much for you. And, we wound up shooting them. And we won that one. The world's a lot, and now of course we're close to Britain. But it didn't work at a certain point. We just weren't British anymore. That seems to me what's happened in Taiwan. They're just not Chinese anymore. They are by ancestry and culture, just like we're British by ancestry and culture, but their self-understanding is drifting away, and as you say, it's the younger generation. So again, how is this going to be resolved with, People's Liberation Army jeeps in the streets shooting at people, or what?
It's an excess of young men. Lots of young men.
Right, exactly. Okay, second question for you.
Have you ever considered the possibility of election fraud going on in Taiwan election this time? Because for one thing, the voter turnout rate shot up 10%.
Yes, it
compared
did.
to 16.
Yes.
And there are several TV stations owned by DPP party announced the almost final differences of the voting just 10 minutes after the poll stopped. There are all kind of evidence showing that, already showing 2.6 million leading just 10 minutes after the voter place stopped, closed. I was in the voting place. It's still paper ballot. You have to count 1,000 votes. That's going to take an hour and 30 minutes.
Yes.
How is it possible to keep them know almost the final result just 10 minutes after the poll stop?
I have not been in a rural area in Taiwan on election night, but I've been there on an election night, and I've been in rural areas in other times. And just as in the United States, you get into little out-of-the-way places, and the politics gets kind of colorful. And so I'm sure that what you saw raises some issues. But it is odd, I think, that you would expect that the DPP would have better control in the areas where they're stronger and would raise their vote totals. And that's not what happened. They lost in those areas. So whatever it is they did, it did not deliver the big gains for them in their strongholds that you would expect.
So you don't suspect there's election fraud?
I'm no expert on that. There may well be some, but
can you explain 10% shot up of the voter turnout rate?
well, that happens. I mean, Trump raised turnout some.
Not 10%.
Well, it depends on where. In some rural areas in Pennsylvania, where my wife is from, turnout was up 10%.
No, I'm talking about overall.
Yeah, not overall. Yeah.
See, in US, there's no way you have 10% increase on the voter turnout rate. There's no way.
Well,
And
that's
also, just 1 year ago, the local election, TPP lost almost 1.5 million votes, total vote. Of course, it's not presidential election. But just a year later, they increased 2.6 million votes. So the difference is 3.6 million votes just within a year. You don't think that's suspicious at all? And also the President Tsai, he tried to win a primary out there on DPP party, and everyone knows that's fraud.
I think I'm gonna let the people who have really studied this election in more detail this afternoon respond to this question. Midterm turnout in the US in 2018 was up about 10 percentage points from the previous midterm. So it can happen, it can happen. And I'm not an expert on fraud.
I think we have time for one more
One
question.
You,
Can
okay.
I have a privilege?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, I know, I know that you've been very careful, but my personal, I really like to hear your personal, like, relatively safe interpretation toward the outcome of this election in Taiwan.
Well, again, I'm
Oh, I would like to have Dr. Achen to provide his personal, relatively safe, because he doesn't want to have a dangerous interpretation. So I to hear his personal interpretation toward the outcome of Taiwan's election.
the students in Taiwan call me Achen. You can call me Achen too if you want. I'm gonna speak from the viewpoint of the United States. We don't have a position on what Taiwan should do, and neither do I personally, about its status. But we do need Taiwan to act carefully and responsibly and to consult with us, because we're involved in this, and the stakes are very high. So the Chen Shui-bian administration was a problem for us. He just wasn't very straightforward with us, and there was a lot of unhappiness with him in Washington during his administration. Ma had been a student here and understood us very well, and that worked much better. Tsai has been cautious and sensible on the issues that concern us more directly. We would probably prefer that some things that she says, she just be silent about, like the 1992 consensus, for example. Makes it harder for us when she says that Taiwan's not a party to that. But on balance, I think she's been good to us and has handled things in a way that doesn't make it impossible for us to deal with Taiwan and lean in your direction when you need us to lean in your direction. So how do I feel about this election? What I would be very nervous about would be the victory of a deep green candidate. Again, not because I have a particular position about Taiwan politics, but because that will cause trouble for the United States. So for those of you who may be hearing about Taiwan for the first time, deep green is the firmly pro-independence side of Taiwan politics. They are just likely to make it harder for us. So one way to characterize my reaction to this election is that she has been, she has to balance. She has a party and she needs to balance with her party, but she's been pretty responsible. I would be much more nervous if the victory had been a deep green DPP candidate. I would be worried about. Again, not because I have a position in Taiwan politics, but because it